So a couple of spotlights, starting with the issue of the environment. So we're always clear, Social Progress Index is a measure of social progress, and looking at environmental quality. Sustainability is a much bigger but environmental quality is integrated into the Social Progress Index. And I just wanted to show you, if I could, this slide we've got here that looks at performance on environmental quality. Because like a lot of what we can do with our data is look at environmental quality against GDP per capita. And the thing I just want you to notice about this is it's one of the components of social progress that has a very wide degree of noise around the trend line. And what that's telling us is that there's not a strong correlation between GDP per capita and environmental quality. No surprise. But also it's a sign that we really need to find solutions, find new ways of actually improving world performance, especially given the critical path that we're on. So I'm delighted that Jón Kaldal is going to lead us through a discussion with some case studies and experts on environmental sustainability. Jón, please.
Thank you. Thank you. Not the panel that we will introduce shortly are not all experts, but in environmental studies, but definitely in their field. I don't know if all of you have heard about the catchphrase from a film called Tropical Thunder. It became like an internet meme. It dwells on the story of the film is of Hollywood actors filming a Vietnam War film in some jungle. And in one this memorable scene from the film, Robert Downey Jr. is giving his fellow actor some acting advice. He said, never go full retard. And the meaning of, if you go full retard, the logic of what you're doing becomes, you know, does not exist anymore. It gets stupid. Being a climate change denier has been in the realms of full retard for some time now, but not so anymore. We have the USA now appointing a climate change denier as the director of their environmental agency, protection agency. So the scene has changed quite dramatically in the last few months. Here to discuss that, we have first, let me have it correctly, Stephan Chambers, the director of Marshall Institute at the London School of Economics and the founder of Skoll World Forum. Welcome, Stephan.
Nice to see you.
Nice to you. From Iceland, we have Brynhildur Davíðsdóttir, professor and director of Program for Environment and Natural Resources Studies at the University of Iceland. Welcome. And then we have Rodney Ferguson, president and CEO of Winrock International. Welcome, Rodney.
Thank you very much.
So I will dive straight in. You know, can the fight against climate change be won when the president of the world's second biggest carbon emitter is Donald Trump, a man who has called climate change a hoax by China and threatened to have his country abandoning the Paris Agreement? Maybe start with you, Brynhildur.
Sure, thank you. And I may add us on a personal note, John and I, we went to school together and we were actually in the same class, right?
Yeah.
So Iceland is so small.
That's Iceland. No.
Anyway, so it's good to see you again.
Same, likewise.
Anyway, so basically, before I sort of start answering this question, and have a quite sort of a clear answer on it, I want to mention a little bit regarding the links between the Social Progress Index and action on climate, because I think an index as the Social Progress Index can be used quite effectively to show what so many, illustrate sort of the co-benefits of being aggressive when it comes to dealing with climate change. Because many of the actions we do have implications for many of the indicators being measured in the Social Progress Index. And I think we can use initiatives like this much more effectively to convince governments to do more. Anyway, but then over to Trump. In terms of the Paris Agreement itself, when there are certain characteristics there that are quite different from actually the Kyoto Protocol, which the Paris Agreement takes over from, essentially. Today, there are all countries, or in the Paris Agreement, all countries have climate commitments. In the Kyoto Protocol, that was not the case. It was only the industrialized nations. So today, China, India, and basically all other nations almost have climate commitments. So the US is not any longer the largest player within an international agreement. They are simply not. So that's one point. The second point is that the agreement was written such that a country cannot immediately, or it's very difficult for a country immediately to withdraw from the agreement. It will take them about 4 years to actually leave. So there are some things in the agreement that are going to limit the impact that the United States actually have on how successful the agreement actually is. So, and then there are two other things that I want to mention. Thus far, and I hope I'm not insulting anybody from the United States here, the US has not quite been at the forefront in terms of dealing with climate change. There have other countries that have led the way thus far. So if the US is not any longer sort of maybe in the picture, I'm not sure that's going to be so serious for the implications or for the impact of the Paris Agreement itself. The impact that the US is going to have is more on if other countries follow suit. That's going to be the big impact. So honestly, I am not so worried about Trump. I think other countries will lead the way because we know, and nations know, we need to do something about this. It's important for economic prosperity, for social progress. So I wouldn't worry so much about the US. Yeah.
Okay. What do you think, Rodney, sorry. Now we have this new climate denier in chief. Is he empowering like a cultural movement against what
First
has
of all,
been?
thank you for asking me to defend the entire, every person in the United States who's a right-thinking person, but I'm happy to take that on. I would agree that we have to take the Trump phenomenon in context. And to your point, for example, the state of California, which is would be the 6th or 7th, depending on how you count it, largest economy in the world, is diametrically opposed in policy and attitude and demography, if you will, to the Trump administration. It has a very aggressive climate change response, both in mitigation and adaptation. That policy includes one of the world's most robust cap and trade programs, which my organization is very happy and honored to be the largest register in the state of California for the cap and trade program. That has been joined recently by the state of Washington, almost in complete compliance with California, and now the state of Oregon is joining. It looks to be joining, at least in part, that protocol. There are 9 states in the northeastern United States under a protocol called RGGI who have their own cap and trade program. But I could go on and on. The point is that in the United States, let's remember Donald Trump is a minority president. He lost the popular vote. 69% of the United States economy resides in states that voted for Hillary Clinton, not Donald Trump. So betting on Donald Trump is betting on the past, is betting on the lack of dynamism in the future of trying to tackle climate change. If I were anyone trying to lay odds, I would bet on the future and the winners here, not the losers in the past. And now that does not mean that there will not be consequences in the short term. There certainly will be. One that I am not as concerned about is that other countries are going to fall in line to follow the United States. There are certain countries that are run by autocrats and totalitarians that may decide that this is the time to reassert their carbon, or make their carbon footprint larger. But again, I would put that in the minority category going forward. So While I wouldn't say I'm quite optimistic about the fight against climate change, there were already enormous challenges we faced even under Paris with full participation by the United States. I think this is frankly a blip in a very long-term trajectory, which sides with the angels on the climate change. So that's my optimistic.
Okay. What do you say, Stephan? Do you agree with Rodney and Brynhildur that we should not be too worried about Trump and his peers in the States?
I don't think I do, actually. First of all, I don't like to refer to Trump. I prefer to talk about Voldemort. And I think that we've learned something very important in the last 6 months. The populist, nativist, nationalist revolution that we see around the world is a very, very interesting example of how we can be wrong-footed, how being right is often the wrong political tactic. Now, what does that remind you of? It reminds you of precisely this conversation, where the evidence has been in for a long time. The science has been clear for a long time. The policy implications of that evidence and knowledge and science and understanding has been clear for a long time. Okay? A bunch of people, let's call it us in this room, are absolutely clear about the risks of a non-adapted, non-mitigated world, or the risks of a carbon world. But it's equally clear that the world has not followed with that. Now, partly that's a function of inherent complexity. This is a bigger problem than the kinds of problems we normally have to deal with. But partly it's a problem and a weakness of the stories we tell and the tactics we use and the coalitions we build and the framing we impose. And we've been talking about this for at least 20 years, to my certain knowledge. We fail to engage, okay? We operate at a routinely over-complex narrative level. We impose solutions on people who are reluctant to see those solutions as part of their lives. They see them as threatening or the diminishing of rights or privileges. We have got these stories comprehensively wrong. And what interests me so much about the Voldemort story is that it's the second version of this. That's another world in which we know when it comes to border controls, when it comes to immigration, when it comes to trade, we know what the data suggest. We know what the evidence is in. Okay? Free trade is our good thing if you want human prosperity and flourishing and social progress. Immigration is a good thing if you want all of the above. We know this. Okay? There will be as great a consensus on that as there is on climate. But we get the narrative consistently wrong. We fail to engage. We fail to create compelling framing devices. I don't know if that's a yes or a no. I think it's a kind of no.
Okay, then this brings us maybe to and I will start with you, Rodney, can the business community, if we don't get the guidance from the government, the policy is not in place or not being heard, can the business community, the private sector, pick up the pace? Is that what do you say about that?
Well, I would say consistent with one of the themes of the conference has been, I don't think the business community alone is going to be able to solve, in as much as you can use the word solve, the problem of climate change. It's clear, it goes without saying, and this audience knows better than anyone, that the business community has to play a role. I have a thesis that as we progress down this road, you're going to see businesses a business is going to have to take a stand increasingly. That you're either all in with your business practices from all the way through your supply chain to your distribution to your retail strategies, that you're either all in on the effort to combat climate change or you're not. And I think you're going to see a polarization, frankly, among businesses, and those that aren't are going to be in a race to the bottom. I believe. A race to the bottom in terms of places where they'll have license to do business, race to the bottom in terms of the customers that will find their product appealing, even when their product is not a consumer-facing product. I think that almost every business in the world is going to, large business certainly is going to have to make that choice. And I think in Europe, I think it's hard. This is an example where Europe is far ahead of the United States. Companies like Unilever, which have, whose CEO has gone as far as to say, I feel so strongly about this, I believe the rules of capitalism and reporting should change, not the other way around. And that's no American CEO of a Fortune 100 company would ever dream of saying something like that. But in Europe, you have a company and a leader who would say that, and others that are either there or not far behind. And even in Asia, there's a fascinating anecdote I've heard, it's been verified by a couple different people. On average, or throughout the year, every day, there is a protest, a civil unrest in China that's not based on political freedom or some of the other indices, but on the environmental degradation. And we never hear about it because often it happens in places far away from media centers, and certainly the government isn't necessarily keen on that. But even Xi Jinping, who certainly you may have different opinions about his performance on other indices, but certainly we believe that there's a baseline sincerity in attacking the problems of environmental degradation and climate change. So all over the world, you're beginning to see this, and companies know full well. They also know, they know their customers. They read their own data. If you look at it demographically, younger generations who will be their customers and their influencers and their tastemakers, depending on the company, are overwhelmingly in favor of policies and will favor companies that are willing to get involved in the fight against climate change.
What about the academics? Do you think we have reached the like a tipping point that it doesn't matter if you have like a populist in charge with that is a climate denier, that the business would just keep on and working in the right direction?
I hope so. I would hope so. I would want to echo what you just said. This is a collaborative effort. We need the businesses engaged, but we need government support as well, because otherwise we're going to continue pricing carbon incorrectly. So we need the appropriate structures to essentially facilitate sort of businesses and business movement such that they engage and invest in climate, say, friendly solutions. But in terms of what businesses can and cannot do, we, for example, here in Iceland, we've been looking at and trying to figure out, so what can Iceland do in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions? And we've done the same for all the Nordic countries. And what we see is that most of the solutions come through the business community, through investment in climate-friendly sort of processes and products and new technologies. And we need government support to facilitate that investment. So it's a collaborative effort. So I would say we need both. And yes, I do think businesses will move forward, and that was really clear in Paris. I don't know how many of you were in Paris, but it was very clear. There was a complete change in terms of how businesses engaged the negotiating community in Paris. That was new to me, because before there was sort of more of a standoffish kind of stand. Now it was more sort of pressure to the governments and to the negotiators saying, we need to do something about this. And I don't think that is going to go away.
Stephan?
I think we have to reframe the question. What is the comparative advantage of business when facing a question as big as this? What is the comparative advantage of government when facing a problem as big as this? And what is the comparative advantage of the third sector? Because the days when single agencies can fix anything are long gone. So the comparative advantage of business is that it is famously good at aligning incentives. Okay, that's what businesses do. They're famously good at allocating resources. Okay, they have a kind of hyper-rational model for assigning resources. Okay, and they're very good at risk capital. Okay, what they're terrible at is self-regulation. or pricing negative externalities, because it's not in their interest to price those negative externalities. But what are governments good at, or what should states be really good at? They should be good at regulation, they should be good at pricing negative externalities, and creating incentives for positive externalities. What are third sector actors good at? They're good at creating movements and momentum and action and consciousness. Put those three things together and you have an argument, you have a really beginning to emerge as a coherent argument that gets beyond this idea that there is a silver bullet and let's call it market capitalism. Okay? And I'm a market capitalist, I believe in those things, but you can't do that on your own. It gets beyond the argument that says, look, this problem is so acute that states have to sit on it, okay, and shoulder the burden for a trading system or a pricing mechanism or a bunch of targets or a set of protocols. That's not the solution either, although it's part of the solution. And you need entrepreneurs, you need people in this room, people who can stitch together these multi-agency, activist-based, incentive-aligned solutions. I don't know if that's an answer to the question. It's probably an answer to a different question.
It's definitely an answer, and then it's it's an interesting take on it. One thing is, we have guys like Bill Gates, an avid fighter against the climate change. He has argued that we need much more than a cut in global emission to solve our problem, climate problem. He has said we need an energy miracle. Some say that we can dial down the fear factor regarding climate change as technology will eventually solve this for us. They will, steer us away from this impending catastrophe. So, can we just sit back and relax and just put our fate in the hand of inventors and the tech industry?
You asking me?
Yes, we'll start with you.
Well, look, there are things to be said on behalf of the tech industry. The price of storing units of energy is plummeting. That creates an incentive for capital and interesting innovations to start looking much more radically at battery storage and so on. But Project Fear didn't work in the anti-Brexit argument. Okay? Telling people again that it's scary and we have to stick at 1.5 to stay alive, it's probably not going to do it because it hasn't done it. Okay? The story is busted. Now, we can keep recapitulating this story. We can say, look, we will make a breakthrough in battery storage. Okay? That's one kind of narrative. Or we can keep telling the story that says we will fry if it goes above 1.5. Neither seems to have had much effect so far on what you might call popular consciousness. Okay. We need a whole bunch of new stories.
Rodney, what do you think? Do we have some miracle on the horizon? Start with you.
Oh, absolutely not. I and our organization, we're founded on the idea that good science and good economics and good arguments can win the day. And we see progress across the world in the application of new technologies, of new practices, which aren't necessarily technologically based, but are based nonetheless in science, and building better market mechanisms, to the professor's point. And when you apply those across the board, and there are hundreds and thousands of examples, that's how you begin to make progress. Low betide anyone that would disagree with Bill Gates, but no, I think the idea that we can rely on technology to come up with some magic bullets or a small set of magic bullets, I think is misguided. There's all sorts of talk about atmospheric seeding, for example, as a way to rebuild ozone and protect from global warming. There's a raging debate in the world over GMOs. Imagine how the debate would follow over atmospheric seeding or investing more heavily in nuclear, for example, which is another thing Mr. Gates has been advocating. We are, for example, as an organization, we're not pro or anti-nuclear energy. We're for scientifically based, safe application of, if that can be a part of a mix, which would help. But so I would sum by saying I think that technology, when it's thought of as being widely spread, micro-targeted in some cases, so that you can have innovation on 1,000 fronts, I think technology will play a huge role. Is there going to be a couple of magic bullets that are going to save the day, like an old B movie in Hollywood? No, I don't think that's going to happen at all.
Okay, let's take from there, Brynhildur. I'd like to ask you if we will find, the holy grail of completely universal green energy tomorrow. That will not, that will not really solve anything in the short term, because implementing that technology probably is it takes time.
It takes time. Everything takes time. And when it comes to the energy system, what is interesting about that, it's very inert, as we say. It takes time to actually change things in the energy system. This is infrastructure that's been invested in. We have old coal-fired power plants. They're going to be alive for a very long time. But in terms of investments or in terms of new technologies, the International Energy Agency has shown, as well as many other institutions have shown, that we already have the technologies here that we need to actually make this transition. We have enough to make this change happen. What we don't have are, for example, better mechanisms for CCS, carbon capture and storage. That's where we need more technological innovation. We don't need any crazy geoengineering kind of solutions, because we already have what we need. And this is what the International Energy Agency already has shown. What they've already also shown is that it is not very expensive to do it. We can do this. They estimate, if I remember this correctly, that we need about, for the next 30 years, we're going to invest about $64 trillion in energy-related investments, sort of business as usual kind of case. Transitioning to renewable energy, changing these investments are going to cost about $16 trillion. So why don't we then just create mechanisms to essentially encourage the energy industry to invest in what we already have, and that makes sense in terms of climate. So I would say, yes, technology is going to do a lot, but we have them here. But technologies are not going to do it on their own. We need to invest in them. We need to get this movement going, and that's where governments come in, because they need to create an atmosphere and a market, essentially, incentives to get industry moving. If we just talk about energy.
Okay, then we maybe become, we can all agree that we've been very good at marketing that the climate change is real. Scientists agree with it. Then that brings us to the practice. What works there, what is working there in practice, in gradually, getting the changes through that we desperately need. Stephan.
Well, I'm not going to talk about technologies, okay, because there are people who are more expert than me on that. Though I will say again, batteries. If you're going to bet on some things, there are some interesting things going on. I think it's about. I think that what works in practice, we know already, is co-creation. People don't like being told what to do. People do not like having their cars and their guns taken away from them. Okay, we know this. This is another one of those things we know.
But let me interrupt you. But it comes down to education, doesn't it? At the same time, on information, enlightenment.
Sure. Look, I'm as much a child of the Enlightenment as any of us. I believe in science and evidence and progress and data and analysis. But the simple truth is that people do not like having solutions handed to them by people who know stuff. Okay, it is absolutely clear. Okay, they don't like it from professors, and they don't like it from governments, and they don't like it from regulators and so on. And the only meaningful way that we know around this is genuine co-creation, where I don't know the answer and come and tell you what it is and how you should behave as a consequence. But we work together with your local understanding of your local circumstances to create the means by which we hand back our guns or hand back our cars or share in an innovation, in a clean innovation economy. So, two direct answers to your question. One, I don't know at the level of technology, and almost certainly anything that any of us think we know is probably going to be falsified tomorrow, because that's the nature of science. But two, it's all about behavior, and what we know about behavior is that co-creation works and imposition doesn't.
Very short, because we have gone to the floor soon. Do you agree? Do we have to frame the story differently? Are we preaching to the, or are we, or you guys who are in the climate business, preaching to the converted, do you need to look outside the church more?
I completely agree with what you just said. And what we need to do is to empower people. We really need to empower people to make good decisions for the future. And to do that, we do need to use different techniques and tactics that we have done thus far. And you're absolutely right. We have failed miserably. We have. We've known about this crisis for a long time, and we haven't moved. In the last decade, greenhouse gas emissions have increased more per year than in the previous 3. So, you know, we're not making progress as we need to. But I agree with you. I think the issue is, and what we need to do is empowering people to do the right thing. How we do that?
Well, I would argue as well that we have to also meet people where they live, to your point, and that is people still want jobs. Yeah. They don't just want jobs, they want well-paying jobs. And we have to work harder to make sure that we disabuse people of the idea that there is a correlation between carbon-intensive energy use and high-paying jobs. One of my favorite statistics is there are more people in the United States who work for the Subway restaurant chain than work in the coal industry. Yeah. And yet, in the narrative, the coal industry took on this huge role, as if though 1 of every 3 people in the United States worked for the coal industry, and it's couldn't be further from the truth. So I think to start, we have to work on the economic message that there is not, in fact, the data show there's a pretty strong correlation between the cleaner a state's energy profile is, the higher their GDP, the higher their job growth, and the higher the wage base of that job growth is. And we have to be able to show that and be more persuasive, but not in sort of a student pupil or professor, the freshman, but we have to be able to engage people where they live and how they live, that this is not about killing jobs. Now, it's also oversimplistic to say that in microeconomies, like the coal industry in West Virginia, for example, yes, jobs were lost that will never come back. But as we know, that had far more to do with technology and international market forces than it had with government regulation. Government regulation played a role, but the lower cost of natural gas and solar and wind in the United States played a far greater role than the government just killing the coal industry, or as large a role to be extra fair. So I think that first attacking the economic argument is the place to start, because the moral argument is a product of the Enlightenment, not the product of people who have to get up every morning and go to work and take care of their families.
Okay, with that we go to the floor. Any questions? None? Here it is.
Hi, I'm Alex Darrett. I was just wondering, when you're talking about co-creation, do you have a good example of that working that you could give us?
Not in climate, but in lots of other social progress like questions. So, for example, it might present as a relatively straightforward question: what do you do with malaria nets that someone else has paid for? Okay, but if you run a bunch of experiments, it's very clear that if you say to people, here's some malaria nets, go use them, okay, the success outcomes are significantly less good than if you ask people how they think they might wish to deploy them. And then you can start adding regression into the experiment. You can say, well, what happens if both parents are in the room when you have the conversation about how they might be deployed? Does that work better, worse, or the same as when only one parent is there? You run another regression where the children are there, and so on and so on. That's what I mean by co-creation. Okay? And applying that way of thinking to social progress interventions, I think, is critical, not just for the reasons of our shared humanity and mitigating arrogance, but because it's more effective.
I can give you a couple. For example, in the southern United States, which is a hotbed of climate denial, for example, it's the fastest growing area of the United States for conservation easements. And this is where you have landowners who genuinely love the land. They genuinely have a commitment to its stewardship and preservation that work with organizations like the Nature Conservancy to offset land or create easements, sometimes 100 years, sometimes in perpetuity, that have significant greenhouse gas emission results. And so another example, this surprises most people, certainly even in the United States and outside. The state in the United States with the largest per capita generation of wind generated energy is Texas. Now, how did that happen? It happened because landowners in Texas, looking to generate revenue from their land, and some of which was depleted oil lands from decades of extraction, saw another revenue source, and that was to lease land or sell land for the generation of wind. And so we're in a world of sort of contradictions now. Our current Secretary of Energy is the former governor of the state of Texas, who has echoed some of the pro-carbon and denial arguments. When he was the governor of Texas, he was an adamant supporter of wind energy. And so suddenly he went through some sort of memory conversion process when he took the job, and he can't remember what he did when he was the governor. He was governor, by the way, for 16 years. So that's a large part of his frontal lobe he had to erase. But the fact is that Texas is a large producer of wind. So those are examples of co-creation where you combine people's economic interest with good business prospects, and you can create. You can do a lot of things, but it starts with having those conversations to try to identify the common good and the common interest and the common advantage between, or the win-win, as one of our colleagues said in the last session.
We have time for one more question and short answers, please.
Yeah. Back to the question of co-creation. Climate's a global issue that's highly interdependent. I'm not an expert, but I was told recently that even if the U.S. went completely carbon neutral, if India burns all of its coal, we're way past 2.5 degrees or something. Are there examples of co-creation on a global level and where we've solved other problems, where we've gotten countries together, or is this the first time we actually have to get the whole world to agree to make this change?
Brynhildur, maybe answer that question.
Well, there are multiple examples, of course, of what we call international environmental regimes, where countries have had to come together to solve a particular problem. And we might maybe it's not a good example, but we might think too, for example, how we solved the issue with ozone depletion, because that was a case where countries came together, but the reason why that was so successful was that we already had a technological solution, actually. Mm-hmm. So that was a that it made simultaneously an economic sense to actually work on work on the ocean depletion issue, and save essentially, basically, us from having the negative impact of having a thinner ozone layer. So that would be one example. Another example.
Okay, so guys, thank you very much for the discussion and the questions from the floor. And with that, we'll just say thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.